So I think this retreat is called Freedom of Heart. I keep forgetting to look at the title. I'm sure you're saying yes, that's good. And often our heart does not feel free. Well, most of us doesn't feel free. And we see how much we're caught by habitual patterns, by attitudes and views, by well-trodden kind of habits between ourselves and another person. Yeah, it's like as if we have kind of habitualized sort of tracks with different people. We're always a certain way with certain people, aren't we? I mean, I think sometimes when we fall in love, it's because we quite like the way that we are with that person. And sometimes the person that we don't like it's because we don't like the way we are with that person. It's very interesting, this whole self and other and who is existing at each time. Our experience of ourselves is so relational, so relational. Yeah. So we've got patterns of, particularly of craving and aversion, and we're all very familiar with that. And we've got deeper layers of ignorance, and a lot of that is just simply the way that a human being is wired up. There is a certain amount that we can change because the structure of consciousness can be changed, but we're working on a very deep level. So to have a freedom of heart means the cultivation of something more positive, but it also means developing an awareness of the obstacles and the releasing of the negative patterning that we've got. Awareness is the key, I think, becoming aware of ourselves at that level. When I was a young mitra, I listened to a lot of talks by Bhante Sangharakshita, and one of them was called From Alienated Awareness to Integrated Awareness. And I listened to this many times, and he lists all sorts of things in that lecture, which I enjoyed, all the kind of different things that we could be feeling and the things that we could have in our awareness. And I remember thinking at the time, I don't know if I want to be a Buddhist, and I don't know if I want to go for refuge to the three jewels, but I do know that awareness is a true refuge. And I felt that in my heart of hearts, awareness is a true refuge. And that, well, the way that Bhante described it, it was almost like an alchemical process. It's like you start becoming aware of different aspects of yourself. And by bringing those aspects into awareness, they begin to change. It's almost just by natural process. So we're trying to bring different aspects, deeper aspects of ourselves into awareness. Both Brigitte and Lucy just described their own processes around that very well. And bringing different aspects, certain kind of tendencies or certain habits and thought patterns into awareness. And then once you start living with that deeper awareness, you start becoming transformed, really. You start becoming transformed. It's an alchemical process. It's a magical process. So we can watch ourselves interacting with the world, and we gradually become aware of our negative reactions, whether it's craving or hatred. I mean, often hatred or aversion shows up quicker because it's so painful. It's so painful to be in a state of hatred. And it's painful for the other person, but it's also very painful for ourselves. Greed, the state of greed, is a bit more comfortable in some ways, although from an awareness point of view or from an ethical point of view, it's just as bad as hatred. But it's easier to live with. So I think it's got a smoother kind of quality to it, and we quite like it. I mean, there are certain aversive responses that we also get to enjoy and we like, and You probably know that for yourself. But certainly in terms of craving, there is a more of an ease and pleasure around it, which we have to, well, in some ways, we have to lose the taste for. You know, we've got a bit of a taste for some of those craving states, and we need to become more refined and more consciously aware of the effect of them. Bante says in Living with Kindness, he says, we experience unskillful states that always seek to drive the wedge of self-interest between things, obstructing the flow of life with the thought of our own benefit or gain. And I like this idea of driving a wedge between things, like between the wedge of us and reality. We've always got this sort of preoccupation with ourself that drives a wedge, and it shows up very readily. Sometimes we can do actions in the world and it seems fine, it seems reasonably fine, but we know that there was an unpleasant taste to it. And we even can see in somebody else's face that they've noticed that there's something not quite right about that. And that's often the wedge of our self-benefit or our self-gain. Well, I had this very extreme example of this actually when I was a young woman. I wasn't going to tell this story, but I will tell it here. I was at art school in Canterbury, and I had a very, very good friend who was at art school with me that year, and she came in one day. We came into the art school together, and she said to me, "Do you mind if we meet up at the tea break? I just need to talk to you about something." I said, "Oh, okay, that's fine." And then I got into lots of thoughts about how she was going to tell me that she didn't like me, she didn't want to be my friend, she found certain behaviour irritating. So I braced myself and thought, this is the end of this friendship, this is what's going to happen. And I met her in a room at tea break, and she said to me, "As you're my friend, I need to tell you something. Last night when I walked home from art school, I was raped on the way home, and I've spent the whole evening in the police station being questioned, and I just want you to know that." So she was communicating something to me about, well, she was doing the opposite to what I thought she was going to do. She was confirming our friendship, and also she told me something very serious. And in that moment, I burst into tears. Okay. And this looked reasonably sociably acceptable, because if a friend had told you that story, then the person witnessing it could burst into tears, couldn't they? That would seem perfectly okay. It's an adequate response. But that wasn't why I was bursting into tears. That wasn't my tears. My tears was, good. She's not telling me she doesn't want to be my friend. She's not telling me that I'm a horrible person. That's what my tears were about. It was relief that my view wasn't being confirmed. And I knew that I was doing something wrong, but I didn't know what it was. And many, many years later, when I was teaching a lot of Brahmaviharas retreats at Taraloka, I began to realize this was the wedge of self. In that moment, when such a strong communication was happening, I had the wedge of self in that moment. And then many years after that, because she became quite a famous TV designer, I was able to track her down and tell her this story, and we talked about it. So I just say this to you because we don't always have these examples so clearly in our experience, but they do exist. And often they're where our consciousness is telling us something's not quite right. It's often not like that as well. Often we think everything's fine, but then later, maybe on a meditation retreat when we're going a bit deeper, we look back on something and we think that wasn't quite right. And that's often the wedge of self. Bhante says, we're aiming for states of consciousness that are free from the dead weight of self-interest and recrimination. It's a nice metaphor, isn't it? This weight of the dead weight of self-interest. You know how difficult it is when something's dead weight. There's no movement in them. It's very difficult to pick up something which isn't able to move. You're just lifting it from your own power. So a dead weight is very heavy. So where does the wedge of self-interest show up in our lives? And that is the opposite to an open heart or a freedom of heart response. And where it shows up is in a very simple mechanism. It shows up when we're invested in getting what we want, or when we're invested in not getting what we don't want. We're very simple creatures. There's nothing very sophisticated about us underneath everything. Yeah? We want certain things and we don't want certain things. And as Shubhavyu was saying this morning in the meditation, we're all wired up like that. We're seeking after happiness and pleasure, and we don't want pain, we don't want suffering, of course, and that's fine. Yeah. So we're trying to maneuver the world from that point of view. So how do we experience those moments? There can be a lot of heat in the body. Brigitte talked about this very well when she did that car journey from that conversation with her mum to the train station, and then on the train as well. I think you talked about that heat and the tension. You weren't able to speak. You were obviously just processing everything in your mind. So there's often a lot of heat in our body. There's often a lot of quite compulsive thoughts going on. I want, I want, I want. I don't want, I don't want, I don't want. I mean, this is just very simple, but they usually function in a more sophisticated way. There can be a lot of physical tension in our body, in certain parts of our body. So it's just worth recognizing the sensations of where there is a reaction, where there is a reaction. And sometimes we know I'm having a reaction. Okay. We know that for ourselves and we name it. I'm having a reaction. At that point, it's a very generalized sort of term. We haven't gone into it, but we know that something's, we don't like something that's happening. And we're resisting it or reacting to it. Like I say, when we're in a state of craving, it's less obvious. We'll have a look at that in a minute. And we might realize we're getting annoyed or we're getting angry. So this afternoon in the reflection period, I'm going to ask you all just to take an experience where you felt there was probably a bit of heat in your experience. That could be, it doesn't have to be the hottest heat you've ever experienced. It could be just a small heat. It can just be that, I don't know, let's think your neighbour started drilling. Your neighbour started cutting the grass just when you were planning to meditate. It could be as simple as that, and you feel a bit of heat. Or it could be that your husband bought a different kind of peanut butter than you usually get. I mean, it can be very small, and there's a bit of irritation involved here. And then I want you to go through this process, sort of recognize that one, feel there's a bit of heat in the situation, feel there's some physical heat or tension in your experience. Just as a way of maybe recognizing that something is going on. And recognize it as a reaction. Simple as that. Recognize it as a reaction. And then go underneath that and just see what is the problem. What is the underlying tension? What is the issue that we're experiencing right now? So let's say it's, I don't know, our partner hasn't bought the right peanut butter. Let's just take something very small. And suddenly we haven't got what we want. So we feel a sort of irritation. And then underneath that, we've got a sense that we've got compulsive, repetitive thoughts usually. They never pay attention when I ask them to do something. Or they only buy the things they want and they forget that they need to buy things that I want too. Or if I want something done well, I always have to do it myself. I mean, whatever the kind of compulsive thought pattern is that's going on at the time. And then I want you to go beneath that and see what is the existential grip of self in that situation. So on the Padlet, we did put up the 3 poisons, but I'm going to try cut and paste it here. Yeah, there we go. So now put it into chat as well. And these are just very, very simple definitions that Bhante quotes in his lecture on the meaning of spiritual community. I find it very interesting that he quotes it in a lecture on, a very, very early lecture on what is the nature of a spiritual community. And really he's saying, quite rightly, he's saying the nature of the spiritual community is to, in a way, engage with one another whilst all these poisons are showing up, if you like, while all these different negative states are showing up, and just sort of living alongside that and then engaging with it from a spiritual point of view. So I'll read out what it says. It's a bit repetitive, but yes, if English isn't if English is your second language, it might be good just to what's the word? Copy it while it's in chat right now, and then when we go into groups, you can paste it into your chat there, and also just look at Padlet if you want. So craving is longing desire to possess objects of sensuous cognition which you like, and to include them in your ego identity, in the hope of getting a sense of security from having them as part of you. So this sounds a little bit more complicated than it is, but basically there are things out there that we want to possess, which we feel we would like to have as part of our security, our identity security. I've got a friend who used to say that she always liked the idea that she had a yoga practice, but she didn't have a yoga practice. What she had was she had a book on her coffee table on yoga. And then every time anyone came into her lounge, they saw this book and they thought, how good, that person's got a yoga practice. Yeah. So that's somebody, that's, you're trying to sort of bolster up your identity, yeah, by owning something like a book on yoga. You like the idea of being seen as somebody who's got a yoga practice. Yeah. And then aversion is the opposite to that. Aversion is defined as fearful and angered repulsion to get rid of objects of sensuous cognition which you dislike, and to exclude them from your ego identity in the hope of getting a sense of security from not having them as part of you. So how does this show up? Think. Let's say part of our ego identity is that we think that we're very punctual. We're always on time, okay? And then one day we have to meet somebody, and because of maybe because your watch was wrong, or because you didn't allow enough time to catch the bus, or whatever the reasons, you are 15 minutes late, okay? So this means that the person that you're meeting cannot just assume that you are always punctual. In a way, they have to change their view of you, and you don't want them to change their view of you. You want to maintain this view that you are in control and always on time. So you lie about your what's happened to you. You don't admit that you overestimated what you could do before you left the house. Yeah. And then later on, in a meditation retreat, you regret that, because you know that you've created, in a way, a bit of a gap between you and that friend because you've lied. And this is simply because you don't want to admit to something that's going to challenge or change a view about yourself. Of course, it's just quite incidental, it's quite random, but it's just how strongly identified we are that's showing up. And then delusion is defined as a stubborn closed-mindedness about learning anything which you feel might threaten your ego identity and upset the sense of security you wish to get from it, but which you are unaware of and therefore feel you must protect. So we don't want to learn anything about ourselves which might threaten our ego identity and upset our sense of security. We want to keep a certain aspect of ourselves in the dark, we could say. We don't want to shine any light on it. There might be an area that you might think of immediately that stands out, although it's very difficult, because if we're keeping it in the dark, we don't want to know about it, so it's very difficult to identify it. But sometimes we have those sort of areas, don't we, which a friend eventually points out, if you're lucky, and it's quite an unconscious area. Yeah, we had no idea that that part of us, or that aspect of us, functions like that. Yeah, I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to go into that, but I think maybe there is something that you can think of right now. So I'm just going to give you an example of an experience I had. So we're having these experiences all the time. They're not anything special. I'm just going to give you an example of myself working with this, okay? So during lockdown last year, there was quite a lot of work happening at Adhisthana. And it was fantastic work that was going on, because if you're in a retreat centre, you can do a lot of work when nobody's there. And then there's lots of things that you cannot do when it's full of retreatants. So you use that space, you use that time. So there was a lot of physical work going on. And then I suddenly realised, as chair of Adhisthana, that there was a piece of work happening which I had a concern about. And I had a concern about the effect it was going to have in the situation. And I also had a concern about myself as chair, because obviously, I hadn't been paying enough attention when this job was discussed. So I felt responsible for any mistakes or any actions that were happening there and then. And I felt slightly, what was the word, blamable. I felt as if I blamed myself for something that was happening. And it was a very scary place to be. I began to realize the implications of this work. And I felt quite a lot of panic about it, a panic about what my responsibilities should have been, and a panic about how this work was going to, affect the situation. And I felt a panic about the group, like the fear of the group. Like I felt frightened that everyone was going to tell me I was doing a bad job. And so anytime that anyone expressed a displeasure, I felt really frightened and panicky about this. And then I got really, really angry. I got really, really angry. I got so angry I felt as if I got they're very polite in the Pali Canon. And I lay on my bed one evening in lockdown when there's nothing to do. I can't even go for a coffee and at least drown my sorrows in a bit of caffeine in that moment. And I thought, God, I felt so angry, and I needed to go and speak to somebody, and I felt so, so angry. And I thought, okay, Saddhanandi, so we know that you are experiencing aversion right now. And we know that aversion is defined as fearful and angered repulsion to get rid of objects of sensuous cognition which you dislike and to exclude them from your ego identity, in the hope of getting a sense of security from not having them as part of you. What is going on? Okay. And I thought, I can't think of all the processes I went through, but I just lay on my bed and I thought, what is the underlying grip that I'm so angry about experiencing? And it was quite simple. I thought, I have not got control of this situation. This is what it is. So what I'm really, all myself at the moment, all the anger and fear and distress that I'm experiencing is my lack of control in this situation. And actually, if you're running a retreat center in a coronavirus situation, a lot of things are out of control. In fact, this virus situation has shown up how much control we do not have with everything around us, the virus around us. So it felt as if I had a lack of control in my life generally, in a way that I hadn't experienced so much before. And also in particular, in relation to this person, I had a lack of control. In fact, I then did go and speak to them, and it was this fantastic conversation. I remember it very well. I was still quite heated and able to say, look, I'm not sure this is the right thing. And they were still quite heated as well with me. And at the same time, I was able to say, what it's doing is freaking me out. It's frightening me because it's all out of control and it's touching that inside me now. This is what's going on for me. But it was at a very, very deep level. And once I'd realized that was what was happening, I could just relax with it. It was really amazing. It was like suddenly I'd arrived at the level that I should have been functioning at. Yeah? So that is just an experience of just trying to unpack myself. And you'll have things like this, I'm sure. I mean, a very small example as well is another example of craving, where I get sometimes a bit compulsive about doing things. You know, I'm quite a busy person. I'm active, and I like to wash up and tidy up and sort things out and do all that sort of thing. And I began to notice the kind of compulsive thoughts that attend that action, which is something like it's like self-congratulatory. I'm doing well, this is a nice thing to do, people will like me for this. Um, I realise all this is being recorded, oh my goodness. Anyway, uh, and I'm just assuming it's universal and it's not just me, but actually if you could just tell me later in chat, that would be very helpful, and we'll work out what we're going to do with the recording later. And one day I was going off to do some busy activity in some place in Adhisthana, and I was congratulating myself, feeling pleased with myself. And I thought, okay, Saddhanandi, what is going on? And what is the longing desire to possess? You've got a longing desire to possess something that's going to, in the hope, you're trying to add something to your ego. What is it you're trying to do here? And I thought, I'm trying to add the identity of being somebody who contributes to life. I want to be someone who contributes to life in a way. And of course we all want to contribute, that's fine, but also I've got an identity caught up in that which says I am lovable because I contribute. Maybe on that level, it's just as simple as that. And if I don't do some of this activity, I will be less lovable. And then beneath that, there's just again a sense of identity in all of that. That's the grip.